All right, so we're going to take the article on the A side and we're going to put them next to each other. Right now, it's just stacking them on top of each other. But what we're going to do is we're going to allow them to begin doing what's called floating. So instead of them stacking on top of each other like this, once they're allowed to float, they then get to move to the side of each other or either way like this. So that way they can sit side by side instead of being stacked on top. Floating is really interesting because you can only float to the left or to the right. You can't float up into the middle. And when you float something, it affects everything around it, especially the things below it. The reason it affects things below it is because the computer is reading from top to bottom. So it doesn't affect the things above because it's already put those in and they're static and ready to roll, but it's going to affect the things below it and allow things to move up in between. The way I kind of like to explain it is like if you took two rubber duckies and you put them into a bathtub. If I had two rubber duckies and I put them into a bathtub, you have these two items that you've put into a bathtub, and you're going to take those and you want them to stay together, right? You want them to stay together so that something can't come up in the middle and float up in the middle. So if I had them and I had the ability for them to float away, something could come up in the middle right here and exist, but I don't want that. I want them to stay together if they were floating on top of a bathtub, right? The question at that point is, how do you keep them together? So thinking about this, we're going to float things and then there's going to give it some space and some movement. The next question is, which direction do you want to float? Do you want to take the A side and the article, if you want them to sit side by side, which direction are they going to float, to the left or to the right? If you think about it, the A side is going to be on the left and the article is going to be on the right. So A side is going to float to the left, article is going to float to the right. So I'm going to go down at the end of A side here, inside the curly brackets of CSS, and I'm going to give it a property of float with a value of left. The second I float that to the left, you will see that the article pops up. But here's the deal. The article is a lot bigger than this. It is not this width. This is not 600 pixels. This is about 400 pixels. So what happened here? Why is it floating up, right? So let's look at this for just a second. I'm going to take the A side background color and I'm going to make it not work for a moment, just for a moment. I'm going to put an X in front of it just to make the background color not work. The second I do that, you'll see the article pops up behind it. So what's happening? The text is floating over to the right and moving over to the right because the A side's width is pushing it away. The A side's width is pushing it over, but the background is floating up behind it. So not only do we float to the left and right of each other, but things can float up behind other pieces, especially if they don't have the ability to float themselves. So I'm going to delete that X and bring the A side back, sitting on top of there. And now that I'm floating this to the left, what do I want my article to do? I want my article to float to the right. So I'm going to go ahead and put in a property and a value of float right on article. The second that I do that, where'd the article go, right? So now if I look at it, I'm going to go ahead and take the width of my page and I'm going to make it wider. The second my page is wide enough to hold the A side and the article next to each other, being 800 pixels wide, my article pops up. Okay, this is important because then if I keep making this page bigger, which is important to note, now they're floating away from each other because the A side's floating to the left margin of the page and the article's floating to the right margin of the page. This is important because now things could float up in here. For instance, let's go take our footer. Let's remove the fact that it's a comment. Delete that and delete the text afterwards for a comment. And now here's our footer floating up in between them. So again, now we've got these two objects that are allowed to float inside of the top of a bathtub, but now they're floating away from each other and things are allowed to float up in the middle. And that's not what we want. We want them to stay together and push everything down below it out so that the footer then exists down at the bottom. I hope you like the objects that I'm using because they're just on my desk. Okay, so we want to keep them together and not allow the footer to come up in between. And that's what we're going to do in the next video. So go ahead and save this so that you don't lose it.